The grinding wheel lurches to a halt mid-rotation, and for a moment, the only sound in the dim chamber is the ragged breathing of the blindfolded donkey, its hide steaming with exertion. A slave steadies himself against the basalt catillus, the volcanic stone still warm from friction, and peers into the narrowing gap between the two grinding surfaces where the grain has become packed too densely. The Pistrina of 79 AD, Pompeii tolerates no pause in production. 12,000 mouths in this city demand their daily panis, and the ovens behind him glow an angry orange, waiting for the next batch of dough. He clears the obstruction with calloused fingers, slaps the animal's hindquarter, and the ancient machinery groans back to life, filling the cramped space with the thunder of stone against stone and the sweet, dusty perfume of pulverized triticum aestivum. This is the Pistrinum, the Roman commercial bakery, and we are standing at the violent intersection of human ingenuity and human cruelty, where civilizations are built one loaf at a time. The structure around us belongs to a network of 35 such establishments scattered across Pompeii's 66 hectares, each one a self-contained factory of flour, fermentation, and fire. To understand the bread that will emerge from this place, the iconic Panis Quadratus, with its 8 symmetrical sections and mysterious lateral groove, we must first travel backward through the production chain, following the grain from its arrival at the Pistrinum's threshold to its transformation into the most recognized loaf in the ancient Mediterranean. The wheat arrives in heavy linen sacks, carried on the bent backs of dock workers, who have unloaded it from broad-bellied navis corbita cargo ships moored along the Bay of Naples. Most of this grain originates not from Campanian fields, though they are fertile enough, but from the confiscated breadbaskets of conquered provinces: Egypt, Africa, Sicily, Sardinia. Pliny the Elder, writing in this very decade, has catalogued these wheats with the precision of a quartermaster. The Sicilian and Alexandrian varieties weighing identical amounts per modius, the Balearic strain yielding an extraordinary 35 pounds of bread from a single modius of grain, and the swarthy Cyprian wheat that produces a dark loaf and must be blended with the pale Alexandrian to achieve an acceptable color. What arrives at our Pistrinum today is almost certainly Triticum aestivum, ordinary bread wheat, the same species that chemical analysis would later identify in the carbonized grain found in the Bakery of Modestus, frozen in mid-production when Vesuvius sealed this city in a tomb of volcanic ash. Before grinding can commence, the grain must undergo its first transformation. Workers pour the raw kernels into large ceramic vessels called dolia, adding salted water that will soak into the grain overnight. This step accomplishes two purposes. It softens the kernels for easier milling, and it bleaches the eventual flour to a more desirable white, separating the grain from lingering chaff and debris that float to the surface. The smell in the storage room is earthy and faintly mineral, the salt mixing with the vegetal sweetness of dormant wheat. By morning, the grain will have swollen to nearly twice its original volume, the cells of each kernel now saturated and yielding. We move now into the milling chamber, and the atmosphere changes instantly from the cool stillness of storage to something primal and oppressive. The room has no windows at ground level. The only openings are small apertures high in the walls, fitted with iron bars that cast striped shadows across the volcanic stone floor. These bars are not decorative. They are prison bars. The workers who operate the mills, men, women, and sometimes children, are enslaved persons who will never leave these walls during their working lives. They share this space with donkeys and mules, the animals' eyes covered with leather blinders to prevent the dizziness that comes from endless circular walking. The floor beneath our feet is carved with semicircular grooves, worn channels in the basalt that guide the hooves of the animals and prevent slipping as they trace the same path thousands of times each day. These grooves synchronize with the millstones above, creating creating what the 2nd century writer Apuleius would later describe as a circular furrow that transforms this space into something resembling clockwork gears, living beings reduced to mechanical components. The mill itself is called a mola asinaria, literally donkey mill, though the Latin also carries the implication of stupidity and brute repetition. Its design is ingenious and brutal. The lower stone, called the meta, rises from the floor in a conical shape, its sides smooth from countless rotations of grain passing across its surface. The upper stone, the catillus, is the true marvel. It is shaped like 2 hollow cones, joined at their narrowest points, creating an hourglass silhouette that functions as both hopper and grinder. Grain is poured into the upper cone, where gravity draws it downward through the narrow waist and into the grinding gap between the meta and the lower portion of the catillus. The catillus rides atop the meta on a central iron spindle called the columella, and wooden beams projecting from square sockets in the stone sides connect to the harness of the donkey, walking its endless circle. By raising or lowering the catillus slightly on its spindle, the miller can adjust the gap between stones, producing flour of varying coarseness, depending on the intended use. The sound is overwhelming, a deep grinding roar punctuated by the click of animal hooves on stone and the occasional crack of a wooden beam under strain. Flour cascades from the grinding gap in a continuous pale waterfall, settling into a wooden trough that encircles the base of the meta. The air is thick with particulate matter. Workers cover their faces with linen scraps that quickly become caked with white paste. The finest flour, called siligo, requires multiple passes through this brutal apparatus, each grinding further, pulverizing the particles until they achieve the delicate texture required for premium bread. This is the flour that will form the panis siligineus, the fine white bread reserved for wealthy citizens and special occasions. But the workers here produce primarily coarser grades, farina for everyday bread, and the bran-heavy remnants sold cheaply to the urban poor, or mixed into animal feed. A slave collects the accumulated flour from the trough, transferring it into ceramic vessels for transport to the kneading room. We follow her through a doorway blackened with soot, and suddenly the character of the space transforms again. Where the milling chamber was all grinding stone and animal heat, this room is alive with the rhythm of human hands. Long wooden tables line the walls, their surfaces worn smooth and slightly concave from generations of dough being worked upon them. At each station, a worker leans into the task of mixing and kneading, their shoulders rolling in a practiced motion that will repeat hundreds of times before the day's production is complete. The ingredients for Panis Quadratus are deceptively simple: flour, water, salt, and leaven. But each component carries the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The water is drawn from one of Pompeii's public fountains, fed by the great aqueduct that brings melted snow water from the slopes of the Apennines through 40 kilometers of underground channels. It arrives at the Pistrinum cool and clean, mineral-rich from its passage through limestone. The salt comes from the evaporation pans along the coast near Herculaneum, where seawater is channeled into shallow beds and left to crystallize under the August sun. And the leaven, the mysterious living heart of this bread, is a perpetual dough maintained in a cool corner of the bakery, fed daily with fresh flour and water, alive with the wild yeasts and bacteria that will transform flat, dense meal into something risen and airy. Pliny the Elder has recorded the methods for creating this leaven, noting that the Greeks established a precise ratio of 8 ounces of leaven for every modius of meal. The Romans learned the technique from Greek bakers, brought to the city as skilled slaves following the conquest of Macedonia in the 2nd century BC, and they adopted it with characteristic practicality, despite some initial disgust at the notion of deliberately encouraging putrefaction in food. The leaven used today has been kept alive for years, perhaps decades, passed down from one pista, one baker, to the next, as a living inheritance more valuable than any bronze or silver. Its surface bubbles gently, exhaling the sour, yeasty breath that signals active fermentation. The kneader combines flour and water first, letting the mixture rest for an hour in a process that allows the proteins in the wheat to begin forming gluten networks. Then comes the leaven, folded into the mass with patient hands, followed by the salt that strengthens the gluten and regulates the speed of fermentation. The dough is heavy, dense with whole wheat flour that includes the bran and germ of the kernel. This is not the ethereal white bread of modern bakeries, but a substantial, nutritious mass that will provide real sustenance to working people. For a standard Panis Quadratus loaf, the dough must weigh approximately 1.3 kilograms, the equivalent of 4 Roman librae, matching the archaeological specimens found preserved in volcanic ash. The kneading continues for 20 minutes or more, the workers leaning their full body weight into each push and fold. Gradually, the dough transforms, becoming smoother, more elastic, developing the characteristic bounce that signals properly developed gluten. Then begins the series of stretches and folds, 4 sessions at 30-minute intervals, during which the dough is gently manipulated and then left to rest, the leaven quietly multiplying within the warm mass and producing the carbon dioxide bubbles that will create the bread's interior structure. The room smells of fermentation, that unique combination of yeast and alcohol and organic acid that signals life working upon dead matter. As the dough rises, we turn our attention to the oven that dominates the rear wall of the pistrinum. It is a dome of brick and volcanic tufa, its interior black with carbon accumulation, its mouth a dark portal approximately 1 meter wide. The furnace has been burning since before dawn, fed with oak and olive wood that produces a sustained heat without excessive smoke. A specialized worker called the vicarius maintains the temperature, judging its readiness not with instruments, but with experience. The color of the glowing coals, the way the heat distorts the air above the opening, the time required for a handful of flour to brown when thrown against the interior dome. The target temperature approaches 200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to set the crust of a loaf within the first minutes of baking, while the interior steams and expands in the phenomenon bakers call oven spring. Now comes the distinctive shaping that will transform this ordinary mass of risen dough into a Panis Quadratus. The worker gathers the fermented dough, punches it down to release the largest gas bubbles, and shapes it into a smooth round, gathering the seams underneath so the top presents an unbroken surface. The loaf is placed into a baking dish, dusted with coarse wheat bran, that will prevent sticking and add texture to the bottom crust. Then comes the mysterious horizontal groove. A length of linen cord, or possibly thin rope, is wrapped around the middle of the loaf, tied with a bow that leaves long trailing ends. As the dough rises for its final proofing, it will expand around this constriction, creating the distinctive waist that marks every Panis Quadratus in the archaeological record. Scholars have debated the purpose of this cord for generations. Was it purely decorative, or did it serve a functional purpose, perhaps allowing the loaves to be hung for cooling and storage, or strung along poles above the sales counter to protect them from mice? Whatever its original intent, the cord has become the signature of Pompeian bread, as recognizable in mosaics and frescoes as the face of an emperor on a coin. The final shaping detail is the eightfold division. Taking the sharpest knife in the workshop, a blade of iron with a wooden handle worn smooth by generations of use, the baker makes 4 deep cuts across the top of the risen loaf, creating 8 triangular sections radiating from the center. These cuts extend approximately 1 centimeter into the dough, deep enough to weaken the structure without severing it entirely. As the bread bakes and expands, these score lines will split open, creating the beautiful segmented appearance familiar from carbonized specimens. The cuts also serve a practical purpose. They allow a large loaf to be easily torn into individual portions at the table. 1 wedge per person, no knife required. Before the loaf enters the oven, it receives one final mark of identity: a bread stamp pressed into the surface of one section. These stamps served as trademarks, identifying which pistrinum produced the loaf, important both for quality control and for legal accountability in a society where bread weights and prices were strictly regulated. Archaeologists have recovered dozens of these stamps from Pompeii and Herculaneum, bearing names of bakers, religious symbols, and occasionally crude images of the grain goddess Ceres. Our hypothetical loaf receives the imprint of its maker, a circle containing the abbreviated name of the pistrinum's owner, pressed firmly into the soft dough. The transfer to the oven requires specialized equipment: a long-handled wooden peel, its flat blade scorched dark from countless insertions into the blazing chamber. The Focarius has raked the coals to one side, creating a hot stone floor upon which the loaves will rest during baking. Working quickly to minimize heat loss, he slides the Panis Quadratus from its dusted dish onto the peel, adjusts its position, and thrusts it into the oven's mouth. The dough hits the hot stone with an audible hiss. Immediately, the surface begins to transform, the proteins and sugars in the flour beginning the Maillard reactions that will produce the golden brown crust. Steam billows from the scoring lines as water within the dough vaporizes and escapes. For the next 40 to 45 minutes, the loaf will bake in the dome's radiant heat, the temperature slowly dropping as the initial fierce fire moderates to a steady glow. The baker monitors progress by watching the color of the crust through the oven's mouth, occasionally rotating loaves that are browning unevenly. The smell that fills the pistrinum is intoxicating. The caramelization of wheat sugars, the toasting of bran, the subtle sourness of fermented dough, transforming into the complex aroma of finished bread. This smell would drift out into the streets of Pompeii, mingling with the smoke of cooking fires and the salt wind from the bay, signaling to passing citizens that fresh bread was nearly ready for purchase. When the crust has achieved the proper mahogany tone and sounds hollow when tapped with a knuckle, the loaf is extracted from the oven and set upon a wooden rack to cool. The cord around its waist can now be untied and removed, leaving behind the distinctive groove that has become embedded in the bread's structure. Steam continues to escape from the scoring lines as the interior crumb sets, and the baker knows from long experience that cutting into the loaf too soon will release this steam prematurely, resulting in a gummy, underdone texture. Patience is required. The bread must cool for at least an hour before it is ready for sale. And sale comes quickly in Pompeii. The Panis Quadratus you have just witnessed emerging from the oven might be purchased at the pistrinum's own counter, fronting directly onto a busy street where customers jostle for position in the morning rush. Or it might be carried in baskets to the Macellum, the great indoor food market, where vendors hawk everything from fresh fish to fermented fish sauce to honey cakes. The price is regulated by civic authorities, calculated based on the current grain supply and the standard weight of a loaf. Bread prices were a matter of political stability in the Roman world, and any baker who shorted his customers risked not just loss of business, but criminal prosecution. The powerful Corpus Pistorum, the Bakers' Guild, policed its own members, while simultaneously wielding considerable political influence. A baker who gave good bread, bonum panem fert, was a trustworthy citizen, a potential candidate for civic office, a man whose word carried weight in elections and public assemblies. The Panis Quadratus purchased by a customer this morning might accompany them home for the day's first meal. Ientaculum, broken into wedges and eaten with cheese, olives, and honey as the household stirs to wakefulness. Or it might be carried to a work site where laborers tear off their portions and dip them into bowls of garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce that adds salt and umami to the bland wheat. By evening cena, the main meal, the bread serves as accompaniment to whatever meat, vegetables or legumes the family can afford. Its dense crumbs soaking up juices and sauces. Its slightly sour tang complementing the richer flavors of cooked food. Some scholars have theorized that the wedge-shaped sections, with their thicker outer edges and thinner pointed centers, were designed specifically to be opened and filled like small pies or early sandwiches, the cord's groove creating a natural hinge point for holding fillings. 81 loaves of Panis Quadratus would be discovered in the oven of the Bakery of Modestus. When excavators reached this site centuries later, each one carbonized by the pyroclastic surge, but retaining its distinctive shape. The 8 sections, the lateral groove, the impression of the bread stamp. They represent the final batch, placed in the oven on a summer morning in 79 AD, when the sky above Vesuvius suddenly turned black, and the world as Pompeii knew it came to an end. The bakers never returned to retrieve them. The donkeys in the milling room never completed their final circuit. The slaves behind the iron-barred windows never emerged into sunlight. What they left behind is more than bread. It is a complete record of an industrial process, preserved in stone and ash, and carbonized organic matter, waiting 19 centuries to tell us how civilization fed itself. The flour still contains identifiable starch granules. The groove still shows where the cord was tied. The scoring lines still reveal the angle and pressure of the baker's blade. In the bakery prisons recently excavated in Region 9, Insula 10, the grooves worn into the floor by countless circuits of donkey hooves still mark the exact path of production, each millimeter of wear representing thousands of loaves, ground, kneaded, shaped, and baked. Gabriel Zuchtriegel, director of the archaeological park, has called these spaces the most shocking side of ancient slavery, places where human beings were reduced to components in a mechanism of flour production, their labor interchangeable with that of blindfolded animals. Yet the bread they produced was also the substance of life itself, the foundation of the Mediterranean diet, the commodity that held urban populations together and made civilized city living possible. The Panis Quadratus, emerging from a Pompeian pistrinum, contained approximately 40% of a working person's daily calories, along with essential proteins, carbohydrates, and the vitamins bound within whole wheat kernels. It could be produced in enormous quantities by concentrated operations that achieved economies of scale impossible in household kitchens. It could be standardized, priced, regulated, and distributed through market mechanisms that anticipated modern supply chains by 2 millennia. The system was exploitative, dependent on enslaved labor and animal suffering, but it was also extraordinarily effective at converting raw agricultural output into edible, portable, storable sustenance for hundreds of thousands of people across the Roman world. When we break bread today, we participate in a tradition unbroken since these ashes cooled. The sourdough starters maintained in modern kitchens are direct descendants of the living cultures kept alive in Roman pistrini. The techniques of kneading, proofing, scoring, and baking have been transmitted across generations without significant interruption. The basic chemistry of flour, water, salt, and fermentation remains unchanged from the formula Pliny recorded in his natural history, and the shape of the Panis Quadratus itself has been recreated by experimental archaeologists, using the carbonized specimens as templates and the ancient texts as guides, producing loaves that emerge from modern ovens, looking remarkably like the examples preserved in Naples' Archaeological Museum. The donkey mill falls silent as evening approaches. The animals led to their stalls and given their rations of hay and water. The fires in the oven bank down to embers, conserving fuel for the pre-dawn start that will begin the cycle again tomorrow. The enslaved workers retire to their quarters behind the barred windows, their muscles aching from the day's labor, their lungs coated with flour dust that will shorten their lives by decades. The last customers have collected their purchases. The unsold loaves are wrapped in linen and stored in cool rooms, where they will remain edible for several days. Somewhere in the streets of Pompeii, a child tears into a wedge of Panis Quadratus, still warm from the morning's baking, the seeds of fennel and poppy bursting between small teeth, the tang of sourdough spreading across an eager tongue. This is the taste of empire, daily, ordinary, and built upon suffering invisible to those who consume its products.